Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Pharaoh, for which we have gotten a bunch more information than we had previously, either directly from Creative Assembly themselves or indirectly from various media outlets and YouTubers which got access to battles in game. So field battles and siege battles specifically, they got to play those. They didn't get access to the campaign map, and I think like looking at Creative Assembly's own video that they did on their channel, an interview style video, they're kind of very shy about showing too much of the campaign map. Like there were certainly some clips and we got to see it, a very tiny amount, but they were certainly not eager to show too much of the game at the moment. What do I think about it? Well, I think it's clear without a shadow of a doubt right now that what Pharaoh is, it's a continuation, you could even say an expansion pack basically for a Total War Saga trade with all the pluses and the minuses that comes with that. Like we have this particular screen where they show the settlement building and they show that we have the exact same resources that we do have at the moment in a Total War Saga Troy. And that isn't necessarily a bad idea as I see it, because I think a Total War Saga Troy had a bunch of great ideas, and we see with the cast dwarfs how good those ideas can be, especially with the resource system, but there were certainly issues. Now, what do I think about what we were shown and what various YouTubers were able to discover? Well, I think there's some very interesting decisions that they've made. Creative Assembly is very aware that right now they need to make the battles more interesting when you don't have magic, when you don't have monsters, when you don't have flying units. So they're focusing heavily on the infantry situation, which they were trying to do in the Total War Saga Troy and ended up failing. They were talking about the fact like Egyptian units might be lighter units than the Hittite units, but that they can handle the desert heat, the desert condition better than the Hittite units, which makes sense. And that they can handle weather effects better, like for instance heat waves. They can handle that better than the Hittite units, which are more heavily armored. Speaking about armor, what certain people have discovered playing through this is that armor can be reduced by getting attacked. So armor can degrade. So heavily armored unit is not going to stay heavily armored when it's getting shot up by archers and skirmishers, slingers. They're going to start losing armor durability, which will significantly reduce its effectiveness. Though I'm skeptical that this will be enough to make it so that heavily armored units will flat out not be useful anymore in battles, right? Because the same principle will apply to more lightly armored units. Sure, if they have less armor, it's probably not going to affect them as much, but heavily armored units are probably going to do better in a melee situation regardless. They also talked about fire and weather conditions. So you have sandstorms, you have heat waves, you have rain, and you do have rain having an impact on the battlefield, not just visual effect or a debuff, but also like creating mud conditions on the battlefield in certain parts of the battlefield when it is raining. So we now have weather effects back in Total War, which is a great change that a lot of us have been looking forward to for quite a while now. And weather is going to play a major role, it seems, in quite a lot of battles. Then you have fire. So fire is going to play a role on open field battles, but it's also going to play a major role in sieges. Just like in Attila, you can use fire to really devastate the defender in a siege. You can light buildings on fire, you can do a lot of damage, you can do structural damage to buildings, you can destroy buildings in sieges. And I think like what they're doing with fire, they're kind of trying to use fire to make up for the fact that we don't have artillery in this game. Makes sense. There was no artillery in this particular time period. And they're trying to use fire to use it as like a way to damage a defender in an entrenched position where it would be very difficult to break through otherwise. That's my read on that situation. In other ways, just based on the things that they've talked about when it comes to campaign mechanics, they didn't dive into too many details, I think, but looking at the campaign mechanic situation, it seems to me that what this game is going to be is a continuation of a Total War Saga Troy in the mechanics that were in play there. They did talk about sieges and how those were going to play, so pocket ladders are no longer a thing. I think like pocket ladders, to be quite honest with you, I think pocket ladders ended up being a far more talked about issue than they were a serious issue, because really the problem with sieges isn't the fact that, oh, units can create ladders out of thin air. I never thought that was the issue. In fact, it's pretty useless to send your units on the wall in Total War Sieges right now, because what ends up happening, you send the unit on the wall, you can't retreat with that unit. It's going to take a lot of damage because it's going to be very exposed, especially to enemy range units. So sending units on a wall in general is a pretty bad idea. It doesn't matter if we're talking about siege towers or if we're talking about ladders. So now ladders are a buildable siege equipment before the siege. Now, here's the thing about this. I think the problem with sieges isn't a question of siege equipment. Yes, we now get the ability to undermine the walls, so we can break down the walls based on what they are saying is going to be specific points dependent on the settlement. But I think the problem with sieges is due to the dynamic that exists on the campaign map. Battles don't exist in isolation. They don't exist in a void. They exist in a campaign situation where on the campaign map, we always want to keep moving. We always want to do something every single turn. And the problem with sieges, one of the biggest issues with sieges as I see it, is that the game on the campaign is pushing us to do as much as possible every single turn, to always fight a battle every single turn. That would be the most ideal scenario, or multiple battles every single turn, to gain resources, gain experience, post-battle loot, etc. But the way Creative Assembly seems to be thinking about these sieges is like, oh, we're just going to have a siege, a player is going to show up to a settlement, and they're going to spend, 4 or 5 turns, more, besieging a settlement. That is the worst possible decision you could take on the campaign. There are several reasons behind this. One, let's say you're attacking a faction, right? And you're besieging their one of their capitals. Well, they might send another army within 2 turns, or maybe even 1 turn. They might send an army that can wipe you out, that army alone, or the combination of that army and the garrison. So your siege will fail. On top of that, even if that's not the case, even if that particular AI opponent can send an army, or one of their allies can send an army to support them, the problem is we will have multiple opponents, various factions to deal with. Maybe we're not at war in that particular point, or maybe we are. Maybe having your main army besieging a settlement for turn after turn after turn is just something that invites other factions to roll over your territory, which is not ideal. So as a player, I don't care about how good the siege equipment options are. I need to win these battles as quickly as possible in as few turns as possible. If siege attacker is removed from the game and I have to at least spend a turn building a ram, that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to build a ram and then I'll attack one gate or multiple gates if units can still attack gates. We don't know if that's the case. Maybe they still can. I think they might be able to do so all the same. But that's what I'm going to do as a player. I'm not going to waste my turns on the campaign map to besiege a settlement just to get some fancier siege equipment. I think a solution to this particular problem would be to allow the player to instantly build siege equipment when they show up to a settlement for a sum of money, maybe not a significant sum, but some resources that you could spend to build up siege equipment to attack a settlement. Maybe it costs lumber. For instance, we are going to have lumber in this game, so maybe it costs lumber to do it. But I think that would be a better solution than just having this idea that, oh, you can undermine the walls. But undermining the walls, just having a single undermine point takes 3 turns based on what they showed. I'm not going to spend 3 turns besieging a settlement in any universe, right? At worst, I'm going to spend 2 turns besieging a settlement, build some rams, and then smash those gates. And that's my winning tactic. And if I can't win the siege battle within 2 turns, I'm not going to bother with it unless it's a very, very important settlement that I just can't avoid. But most of the time, if I have a choice as a player to engage in a siege or just go do something else, I'm going to do something else. And if that dynamic doesn't change, sieges are still going to be pretty terrible, I think, in Total War. Battles do not exist in isolation. But I do like some of the things they're showing. I do like the armor degradation. I do like the weather effects. I do like the focus on fire. Those are the kind of things that I do appreciate about what they're doing. And we'll see what kind of campaign mechanics they're going to introduce in Total War Pharaoh, because these specific developers that worked on the Total War Saga Troy, they did have some great ideas. The problem was the execution. And I need to dive in to a Total War Saga Troy to talk about what the major issues were, some of the biggest issues that game had. So looking at a Total War Saga Troy, there were a bunch of great ideas in theory, but in practice, due to balancing, they ended up working pretty badly. And it really is a balancing issue. I think Creative Assembly can implement these things well if they do put in more effort, and I think Troy did suffer because it was a smaller budget game. It was a Saga game. We'll see how they do handle Pharaoh, since Pharaoh is basically a continuation of Troy. But the four main issues I would say that Troy did have, well, first off, you have the gods. And when it came to the gods, you did have a bunch of different bonuses that you could get, but the problem was that one god, specifically Aphrodite, was substantially better than all the others. Like, you have a passive effect to the gods, and then you have an active effect with prayers. With Aphrodite, if you got her to tier 2, you would get 30 growth and 1 happiness per non-aggression pact. And at tier 1, you would get 10 diplomatic relations with all factions. That is a very substantial benefit in its own right. But praying to her, you would get growth, you would get happiness, and the higher tier you were with her, the more this effect would stack. It ended up being pretty damn ridiculous. Like, look at her at tier 4 over here. You're looking at 50 growth, 5 happiness, then 5 more happiness for non-aggression packs, 30 more growth. That's 80 growth and 10 happiness. That is pretty absurd. So that's the issue with the gods. Another issue came down to the legendary lords and the regular lords in the game, which are called heroes and epic heroes in this game. And basically, in combat, someone like Hector with a similar skill line like him would be substantially better in battle because, one, you have an active effect. In Hector's case, he gets weapon damage, armor piercing damage, but he does lose in terms of attack interval. But he would use Rage. Now, using Rage would build up the meter towards Aristea. Now, this isn't available in the historic mode of a Total War Saga Troy, but building up towards Aristea and then getting the HP, armor, and melee attack would give you a substantial benefit in battle. Like, Hector would win duels just purely because of the abilities he had. And heroes like Hector with the similar skill line would do much better in battle. On the campaign map, there was also imbalance. For instance, a hero like this one, a Warlord Commander, while he doesn't have the same benefit in battle, he does get some fairly substantial campaign benefits. In his case, he gets growth and happiness, which you can improve even further when you are garrisoned. So we're looking at substantial growth and happiness benefit with certain heroes that others do not have. It ends up being pretty ridiculous when you add everything together. Like, you have the Wise skill, which can literally grant you stone and influence. So it ends up being overall absolutely absurd when you're looking at a lord like this or a hero like this. So that's the second issue. The balancing between lords was completely broken. The third issue came down to the faction balancing. One of the things they've talked in Pharaoh is like, oh, we're going to have lighter units for the Egyptians, and the Hittites are going to have heavier units, but the heavier units are going to do worse in sandstorms. We'll see how they balance that out in that game based on, the things we've seen. But the problem is that the idea was that lighter units in Troy would have more speed, which made sense. But the problem was that heavier units would win choke point battles. Guess what? The minor settlement battles, the major settlement battles, they had a lot of choke points. So the Trojans in particular ended up having probably the best unit roster in the entire game because they had better chariots, they had archers, some of the best archers in the game. Well, not necessarily the best, but better archers than the Achaeans have. And their tier 1 swordsmen were flat out better than what the Achaeans could get until tier 3. Like, these guys would win in battles that the Chians would flat out lose with their spearmen. And it got worse as you progress through a campaign. Like, early on in the campaign, you could tackle it, but as you progress in the campaign, the Trojan heavy infantry would really take its toll. For instance, if you're looking at the heavy Trojan spearmen, you see a unit that's heavily armored, heavily armed, that does a lot of damage, that does quite a lot of damage overall, and these guys would just annihilate opponents in battle. Or Hector's special units, the champions of Troy, which are even more ridiculous. And these kind of units, like even in field battles without the choke points, would win the battle once they engage. Like, one of the problems I encounter playing as Achilles is all my Myrmidons, which by the way are more expensive to recruit on the campaign than many of Hector's units, would end up losing to these kind of units. So that ended up being a fairly substantial problem to deal with on a campaign when you are playing as certain factions than others. Then the fourth biggest issue, and I'd say the biggest issue by far that this game had, was the resource system. Like, the resource system in theory is pretty great because we've seen how well it can be, or a similar system can be for the Chaos Dwarfs, but in Troy it ended up being awful. And we know we have the exact same resource system in Pharaoh, and the issue is geographic balancing. So looking at Hector's situation over here, you can see that I have gold, wood right now that I have acquired, could have gotten with stone, but it's a complicated diplomatic state of affairs. But there's a lot of resources available over here that other factions don't have. In fact, Hector isn't even the best in respect to this. Aeneas is, because he literally starts with stone and wood over here. He can get even more stone. He can get even more wood, quite significantly more wood and gold, and his campaign very quickly. Like, all of this territory Aeneas can get, and that makes him a powerhouse on the campaign map. The geographic balancing significantly hurt this game because the Trojans, or at least Hector and Aeneas, and even Sarpedon, had access to a lot of these resources far quickly, and so did the Amazons, whereas the Chians, you're looking at Menelaus, Agamemnon, Diomedes, Ajax, they were far more limited in resource. Because if we look at the campaign map over here, like looking at the Chian situation, like there's 2 gold mines over here, only 2 gold mines in this situation. Like, there's bronze, sure, but there's only 2 gold mines, and one of them is held by quote-unquote ally. The other one is held by Athens, which is a fairly substantial faction to actually have to fight in your campaign, whereas the Trojans just end up having access to these resources far easier, far quicker. Like, there's 3 gold mines next to Hector. Sure, if you declare war on these factions, if you break the non-aggression pact, that is going to hurt you in a pretty substantial manner in your campaign if you decide to do it over here. So that can be a major problem to tackle in the campaign, but it is at least available. And besides, there's plenty of resources over here that I can get access to anyway. So you end up with a much better economy with certain factions than others in this game. It's a balancing issue. It's not an issue with the idea itself. It's just a question of balancing, and how Creative Assembly tackles these issues will determine, as far as I see it, whether or not Pharaoh is going to end up a success or a dismal failure. Beyond these issues, they also talked about how the Bronze Age collapse is going to work, because you are at the beginning of the Bronze Age collapse over here, and what's going to happen is civilization is going to start collapsing, and it's going to have an effect on how your campaign map looks. I guess we'll see how that plays out, but from a gameplay standpoint, they were talking about how the sea peoples and the desert nomads are going to get stronger as the campaign progresses, as civilization collapses. So that, I guess, is going to be the end game crisis that they're going for in this game, which is obviously based on what they did in Total War Attila with the Huns, and that was, of course, inspired by barbarian invasions in the original Rome expansion. So we'll see how they handle that particular aspect. I think endgame crises can be a mixed bag in the best case scenario. So I'm really hopeful that this time around they do a better job with it than they've done in the past, because like Chaos Invasion of Warhammer 1, yeah, sure, it's fun once or twice to play through, or the Huns are okay to deal with once or twice in Attila, but it does get tiring very, very quickly. So if they don't tackle this well, then you might end up in a situation where the replayability of the game is not the greatest. Finally, I do need to mention this. I think that the marketing team, not the developers, the marketing team, didn't necessarily handle this in the best possible fashion. I think a lot of people would have liked to have seen more gameplay footage as opposed to just a bunch of YouTubers and media outlets just getting access to the game and only to carefully choreographed battles. Like certain YouTubers mentioned that, oh, the battles we got were basically like battles you would showcase to a media outlet like IGN. I think they should have shown more of the campaign map. And quite crucially, I'd say, and quite very importantly, I'd argue, that when you're talking about Pharaoh, you need to, that Creative Assembly needs to be aware, and if they're not aware, then that's a pretty significant issue. They need to be aware that a lot of people don't have a good opinion of a Total War Saga trade for many obvious reasons. And that if Pharaoh is to succeed as a game, then it needs to prove itself that it is a vastly superior product. Not just an expansion pack that fixes some issue, improves some things here and there, but to be a genuinely good game. Because Troy, although I certainly don't detest it, in fact, I did enjoy it quite a bit as a fan of the setting in particular, and the mythology, I think a Total War Saga Troy for a substantial number of people was a disappointment. And if they're now asking us to pay for what amounts to an expansion pack to that game, well, I don't think they're going to succeed in that. So they really need to do better. They need to show us more of the campaign. They need to show us that they've looked at the issues of Troy in terms of balancing, in terms of campaign pacing, in terms of campaign design, all those issues that Saga Troy had, and show us that they've actually improved on those subjects in a substantial manner. Until that point, well, there's a great deal of skepticism, and I think this game is going to be tainted in general by that skepticism. A lot of people are not interested in this game at the moment, and that is something that Creative Assembly needs to deal with from a marketing standpoint. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.